Today I will explain how we survived the deadly plague. But before that, let me know when and where are you watching this video from. Now, let's begin. The world before the Black Death felt solid. People believed life had a rhythm given by God, by the seasons, by the slow turning of time. Villages woke with the sun. Church bells marked the hours. Farmers worked the land their fathers had worked before them. Kings fought wars that seemed distant to peasants. Death existed, but it was familiar, expected, and usually slow. No one imagined that one invisible enemy could tear this world apart in just a few years. In the early 1300s, Europe was already tired. Harvests had failed again and again. Cold rains ruined crops. The Great Famine had weakened millions. People were thinner, poorer, and more desperate than they had been in generations. Bodies were fragile. Immune systems were weak, though no one knew such words yet. They only knew hunger, cold, and fear. It was into this exhausted world that the Black Death arrived. The disease did not announce itself with trumpets. It traveled quietly, hidden in ships and sacks of grain. Far to the east, in Central Asia, traders moved along the Silk Road, carrying silk, spices, stories, and unknowingly, death. Rats lived alongside humans everywhere. They fed on scraps, slept in walls, and followed trade routes like loyal shadows. Fleas lived on those rats, biting them, feeding on infected blood. When rats died, the fleas jumped to humans. This tiny jump changed history. By 1347, ships reached the ports of the Mediterranean. When they arrived, sailors were already dying. Some collapsed on the decks. Others had black swellings under their arms and in their groins. Their skin darkened. Fever burned through their bodies. Within days, they were dead. Port cities like Messina, Genoa, and Venice watched in horror as death stepped onto their shores. Officials tried to send the ships away, but it was too late. The disease had already escaped. At first, people did not understand what they were seeing. A healthy man could wake up in the morning and be dead by nightfall. Families vanished in days. Priests fell while giving last rites. Doctors ran, not toward the sick, but away from them. Streets filled with the sound of coughing, crying, and church bells ringing non-stop for the dead. The smell of decay mixed with incense and fear. Most people believed this was God's punishment. Others blamed poisoned air, evil planets, or foreign enemies. No one knew about bacteria. No one knew about fleas. They only knew that touching the sick often meant dying yourself. Fear became stronger than love. Parents abandoned children. Friends refused to open doors. Cities tried desperate measures. Fires were lit to clean the air. Animals were killed. Strangers were chased away. And yet, somehow, humans survived. That survival did not come from bravery alone. It came from instinct, chance, isolation, and and slow learning through unimaginable loss. While millions died, some lived. Entire villages vanished, but others were spared. In the middle of chaos, small patterns began to appear, though no one fully understood them at the time. In the countryside, far from crowded cities, some people survived simply because they were isolated. A farm tucked away in hills, a mountain village cut off by snow, a monastery behind thick walls. Distance became a shield. In cities where people lived packed together, death spread like fire. In open lands, it moved more slowly, sometimes missing places entirely. People also began to change their behavior, not because of science, but because of fear. They stopped gathering. Markets closed. Travelers were avoided. Some cities locked their gates. Venice created one of the most important survival tools in history, though they did not realize it then. They forced arriving ships to wait offshore for 40 days before unloading. This period was called 40 giorni, 40 days. From this word came quarantine. It did not stop the plague completely, but it saved lives. Inside homes, people tried anything. They burned herbs. They carried flowers to mask the smell of death. Some wore charms. Others prayed day and night. Many of these things did nothing against the disease, but some actions, by pure accident, helped. Avoiding crowds, keeping distance, limiting contact. These small changes slowed the spread, even if people did not understand why. Survival also depended on pure luck. A flea bite here, not there. A rat dying in one house, but not the next. Some people were naturally more resistant. Others recovered after falling ill, gaining immunity they could not explain. These survivors became rare witnesses, walking through silent streets filled with the dead. The social order collapsed, but from that collapse came strange protection. With so many dead, farms were abandoned. Cities emptied. Fewer people meant fewer hosts for the disease. The plague burned fast and bright, then slowly starved itself. Death had limits, even if it did not feel like it at the time. As months turned into years, waves of plague came and went. Each time, humans learned a little more, not through books, but through scars. They learned where death moved fastest. They learned when to flee. They learned that isolation mattered, even if they did not know why. Survival was not planned. It was stumbled upon, paid for with millions of lives. And as the living looked around at the empty world left behind, they faced a terrifying question. If so many were gone, if the old rules no longer worked, how should life continue now? That question lingered in the silence, waiting to be answered, as humanity stood at the edge of a broken world, about to change forever in ways no one could yet imagine. When the first wave of death passed, the silence it left behind felt unnatural. Entire streets stood empty. Doors hung open. Animals wandered through towns without fear. Survivors stepped outside cautiously, as if death might still be hiding in the shadows, waiting to strike again. The Black Death had not only killed people, it had shattered the meaning of normal life. Those who lived carried heavy questions. Why them? Why not their neighbors, their families, their children? There were no answers, only guilt and disbelief. Many survivors felt haunted, as if the dead were watching them. Sleep became difficult. Dreams were filled with coughing, screams, and the sound of carts rolling through streets to collect bodies. Burial itself had changed. There were too many dead to bury properly. Mass graves became common. Priests could not keep up with prayers. In some places, bodies were simply piled outside city walls. This horror forced people to confront death constantly. It was no longer something that happened quietly at home. It was everywhere, visible, unavoidable. And yet, survival demanded action. As the plague returned in waves, humans began reacting faster. They did not understand the disease, but they recognized patterns. They noticed that crowded places suffered most. They noticed that travelers often brought sickness with them. Slowly, fear turned into rough, instinctive strategy. Cities began to close themselves off. Guards were placed at gates. Anyone showing signs of sickness was turned away. In some regions, houses with sick people were marked. Families were locked inside, sometimes left to live or die alone. It was cruel, but it saved others. Survival now meant choosing the many over the few. Some people fled early, escaping cities at the first sign of illness. Wealthy families escaped to countryside villas. Scholars, merchants, and nobles isolated themselves, believing fresh air and distance offered protection. In many cases, they were right. Isolation worked, even without understanding why. The poor did not have this luxury. They stayed behind, packed into small homes, breathing the same air, touching the same surfaces. Yet, even among them, survival appeared. People began spacing themselves apart when possible. They stopped sharing beds. They avoided the sick. These changes came from fear, not knowledge, but fear kept them alive. Across Europe, something else changed as well. Authority weakened. Kings, lords, and officials died just like peasants. Laws stopped being enforced. Some people turned to crime. Others turned to kindness. In the face of death, social masks fell away. People showed who they truly were. Survivors formed new bonds. Orphans were taken in by strangers. Communities rebuilt themselves with whoever remained. Labor became valuable. With fewer workers, peasants demanded higher wages. For the first time, common people had power. This shift would reshape society forever. But at the time, it was simply another survival mechanism. To live, people had to adapt, socially and economically. Religion also changed. Many lost faith, believing God had abandoned them. Others clung to belief more tightly than ever. Some joined groups that walked from town to town, whipping themselves, begging God for mercy. These flagellants believed suffering would stop the plague. In reality, their movement often spread the disease further. Once again, survival came not from intention, but from accident. Medical knowledge remained limited, but doctors tried. They wore strange masks filled with herbs, believing bad smells caused illness. While their theories were wrong, some practices helped unintentionally, covering the face, avoiding direct contact, keeping distance. These habits slowed transmission, even if doctors didn't realize it. Nature itself played a role. As populations fell, forests reclaimed farmland. Wildlife returned. Cleaner environments reduced rat populations in some areas. Fewer rats meant fewer fleas. Fewer fleas meant fewer infections. The plague began to lose its grip, not because humans defeated it directly, but because the world around them changed. Survivors also developed immunity. Those who lived through infection often did not fall sick again. Over time, communities with more survivors became more resistant. The disease still returned, but it killed fewer each time. Humanity was adapting biologically, slowly and painfully. Children born after the worst years grew up in a different world. They had fewer siblings, more land, more opportunity. The memory of mass death stayed with them, shaping how they lived. They avoided crowds. They feared strangers. They respected isolation, even without understanding its true power. But the plague was not finished. Just when people began to feel safe again, just when markets reopened and laughter returned to streets, new outbreaks appeared. Bells rang again. Fires burned again. The enemy was not gone. It was waiting. And humanity, scarred but learning, prepared once more to face the invisible threat, armed now with fear, memory, and the hard lessons written in the bones of the dead. By the time the Black Death returned again, fear had changed shape. It was no longer pure shock. It was memory. People remembered how fast life could disappear. They remembered the smell, the silence, the carts of bodies. And because they remembered, they reacted differently. Not better in a modern sense, but smarter in a human one. When rumors of sickness appeared, towns did not wait. Church bells stopped ringing for celebrations. Markets slowed. Inns closed their doors. Travelers were questioned, sometimes violently. In some places, strangers were not allowed in at all. Fear turned into walls, locks, and distance. Survival now depended on how quickly a community could isolate itself. Families developed their own rules. They ate separately. They slept apart. They avoided unnecessary touch. Mothers stopped letting children play freely in the streets. Weddings were postponed. Funerals became small or disappeared entirely. Life shrank inward, becoming quiet and cautious. Inside homes, people cleaned more than ever before. Floors were scrubbed. Clothes were burned if someone died. Air was let in through open windows. While people still believed in poisoned air, these habits reduced contact with infected fleas and surfaces. Again, survival came from actions driven by fear, not understanding. Doctors, though still limited by false beliefs, gained experience. They noticed that some treatments killed patients faster than the disease itself. Bloodletting weakened already fragile bodies. Slowly, some stopped using it. Observation began to matter more than ancient texts. This was not yet science, but it was the beginning of learning from reality instead of tradition. Across Europe, governments began keeping records. Death counts were written down. Patterns were noticed. Which neighborhoods died first? Which trades suffered most? Which seasons were deadliest? These records did not cure anyone, but they helped officials act faster next time. Knowledge, even incomplete, became a survival tool. One of the most important changes happened quietly. People learned when to run. Those who survived earlier outbreaks often fled cities at the first sign of sickness. They packed quickly and left behind homes, shops, even family members. It was a brutal choice, but one that saved lives. Abandoned cities became ghostly, but those who escaped often lived. The countryside became a refuge, but it was not always safe. When too many fled, disease followed. Villages learned to turn people away. Gates were closed. Bridges were guarded. Some communities survived simply because they were willing to say no. Social trust broke down, but new forms of cooperation appeared. Groups agreed to isolate together. Monasteries locked themselves away completely. Some succeeded, others failed. Survival became a gamble of choices, timing, and chance. Meanwhile, the plague reshaped the human body itself. Those who lived carried genetic traits that made them more resistant. Over generations, these traits spread. Humanity was changing, slowly adapting to the invisible enemy. Survival was now written not only in behavior, but in blood. The emotional cost was enormous. Survivors lived with constant anxiety. Every cough sparked fear. Every fever felt like a death sentence. People aged faster. Joy felt dangerous. Laughter felt inappropriate. Life was lived cautiously, quietly, as if noise might summon death again. Art and stories changed. Paintings filled with skulls and decay. Songs mourned lost worlds. But these expressions also helped people cope. They gave shape to grief. They reminded survivors that they were not alone in their fear. Shared suffering became a strange form of comfort. Children growing up during these years learned harsh lessons early. They learned that adults could disappear overnight. That safety was temporary. That survival required attention and restraint. These children became cautious adults, shaping a society that valued distance and preparedness more than ever before. And yet, despite all this learning, the plague remained unpredictable. It did not follow rules perfectly. Some crowded places survived. Some isolated ones died. Some careful people fell sick. Some reckless ones lived. This randomness kept fear alive. As the years passed, humanity stood in a strange balance. Not victorious, not defeated, just enduring. Learning enough to survive, but never enough to feel safe. And somewhere in the background, unseen and silent, the plague waited for its next chance to return, testing whether these hard-earned lessons would be enough to keep humanity alive once more. As the years moved forward, something subtle but powerful began to happen. Humans did not just react to the Black Death anymore. They began to anticipate it. Fear was no longer blind. It had memory. It had experience. And that experience slowly reshaped how people lived, how cities were built, and how survival itself was understood. In many towns, the idea of permanent separation took root. New buildings were spaced farther apart. Streets were widened, not for beauty, but because people believed open space meant safety. Crowded slums were feared. Fresh air became precious. Even without understanding germs, people sensed that space saved lives. Ports became places of suspicion. Ships were watched closely. Crews were inspected from a distance. If sickness was suspected, ships were forced to wait offshore for weeks. Some sailors died alone at sea, staring at cities they were not allowed to enter. It was cruel, but cities that enforced these rules often survived better than those that didn't. This was one of the darkest lessons humans learned. Survival sometimes demanded hard, heartless choices. Inside cities, officials created plague houses. Sick people were taken there, away from their families. Once inside, many never returned. These places were feared more than the disease itself, but they reduced spread. Isolation, once accidental, became deliberate. People also changed how they handled death. Bodies were no longer washed lovingly by family members. Touch was avoided. Funerals became brief, distant affairs. Mourning turned inward. Grief became private. This emotional isolation hurt deeply, but it saved lives. For survivors, daily life felt like walking on thin ice. Everyone watched everyone else. A pale face, a cough, a limp, these were enough to make neighbors step back. Communities became quiet, tense, alert. Survival depended on noticing danger early and acting fast. Trade adapted as well. Goods were exchanged without direct contact. Coins were soaked in vinegar. Letters were smoked over fires. While these methods did little against bacteria, they reduced handling and movement. Once again, humans stumbled into safer behavior by accident. Doctors began to disagree with each other. Some still trusted old theories. Others trusted what they saw with their own eyes. Few noticed that those who avoided the sick often lived, that those who fled early survived more. This was dangerous thinking because it challenged tradition, but it planted the seeds of future science. Meanwhile, the Black Death continued its slow march through generations. It returned every few years, sometimes weak, sometimes strong. Each return tested whether humans remembered what they had learned. Some forgot, some ignored warnings, and they paid the price. But overall, death rates slowly declined. Not because the plague became kind, but because humans became harder to kill. Children born in this era grew up in a world shaped by survival rules. They did not question distance. They did not question quarantine. These were normal to them. Fear was inherited, passed down like stories and scars. Families planned differently. They saved more. They prepared to flee. They accepted loss as part of life. Emotional strength became as important as physical strength. Those who broke mentally often did not survive long, even if they avoided disease. In monasteries and universities, scholars quietly collected knowledge. They wrote about outbreaks. They compared notes. They began to understand that the disease followed routes, roads, ships, markets. This understanding was crude, but powerful. It turned chaos into something almost predictable. Still, survival was never guaranteed. A single mistake could undo everything. One infected traveler. One ignored warning. One crowded festival. The plague punished carelessness without mercy, and so humanity lived in a strange rhythm. Years of calm, sudden terror, recovery, then fear again. This cycle reshaped the human mind. People learned patience. They learned restraint. They learned that survival was not about defeating death, but about outlasting it. As generations passed, the Black Death slowly lost its grip. Not gone, but weakened. Humanity had not beaten the plague with weapons or medicine. It had survived by adapting its behavior, its cities, its habits, and its thinking. But this survival came at a cost. Trust was damaged. Communities were cautious. Love was restrained by fear. The world felt colder, quieter. And yet, beneath that caution, something new was forming. A new way of thinking. A belief that humans could observe, adapt, and shape their own survival. That belief, fragile and unspoken, would soon begin to change the world far beyond the plague itself. And as the shadow of the Black Death slowly pulled back, humanity stood on the edge of a transformation it did not yet understand, ready to enter a new age shaped by everything it had suffered. As the Black Death continued to return in waves, something deep inside humanity began to harden. Not in cruelty alone, but in awareness. People no longer lived as if tomorrow was guaranteed. Every sunrise felt borrowed. Every normal day felt fragile. Survival was no longer passive. It became an active way of life. In many towns, people started watching the world differently. They noticed patterns in time. Plague often came in warmer months. It followed trade routes. It struck hardest where people gathered closely. These observations were whispered in homes, passed quietly between families. Knowledge did not come from books yet. It came from memory, loss, and fear. Entire communities developed unspoken rules. When someone coughed too much, neighbors stepped back. When fever spread, doors closed. When rumors came from the next town, people prepared to flee. Survival depended on speed, not certainty. Waiting for proof often meant death. One of the biggest changes happened inside the human mind. Before the plague, people trusted tradition blindly. Old beliefs were rarely questioned, but the Black Death broke that trust. Ancient medical texts failed. Prayers failed. Astrological predictions failed. And when belief failed, observation took its place. People began trusting what worked, even if they didn't know why. If isolation saved lives, isolation became sacred. If fleeing early worked, fleeing became wisdom. If avoiding crowds helped, crowds became dangerous. These lessons were simple, but powerful. They spread faster than any official law. Cities that survived learned to reorganize themselves. Waste was moved farther away. Streets were cleaned more often. Water sources were protected. While these actions were meant to improve smell and appearance, they reduced disease spread. Survival hid inside these small changes. At the same time, social relationships transformed. People became cautious with affection. Handshakes disappeared. Embraces became rare. Physical closeness, once normal, now carried risk. Love learned to express itself from a distance. Families also changed how they valued children. With so many dying young, survivors cherished those who lived. Education became more important. Teaching survival knowledge, not just faith, became essential. Parents taught children when to be cautious, when to run, when to stay silent. The economy shifted dramatically. With millions dead, labor was scarce. Workers demanded more pay. Landowners were forced to negotiate. This shift gave common people power they had never held before. Better living conditions followed. Better food, more space, stronger bodies. These improvements made future generations more resistant to disease. Survival was no longer just about avoiding death. It was about building a life strong enough to withstand it. Meanwhile, the plague itself began to weaken. Not because it disappeared, but because it met resistance everywhere. Humans had become harder targets. Communities reacted faster. Bodies were stronger. Immunity spread quietly through bloodlines. Still, fear never fully left. Every few years, the bells rang again. A new outbreak, a new test. Each time, fewer died. But the memory of earlier devastation kept panic alive. People never fully relaxed. The Black Death had taught them that comfort was dangerous. Art from this period reflected that tension. Images of death stood beside images of life. Beauty and decay shared the same space. This art was not meant to scare. It was meant to remind, to keep memory alive, to keep people alert. Religion evolved too. Faith became more personal, less dependent on institutions that had failed to protect people. Some turned inward. Others questioned everything. This questioning spirit would later fuel revolutions in science and philosophy. But for now, it simply helped people survive by encouraging independent thought. Doctors slowly improved. They recorded cases, compared symptoms, noted recoveries. These notes were imperfect, but they mattered. They represented humanity's first steps toward understanding disease as something natural, not divine. Survival was no longer a mystery controlled entirely by fate. It was something humans could influence. And yet, beneath all this progress, trauma lingered. Survivors carried invisible wounds. They feared joy. They feared hope. They feared believing that the worst was over. Many lived with constant anxiety, expecting death at every cough. But humans are resilient. Even in fear, life continued. Children were born. Fields were planted. Songs were sung quietly. Love existed, even if cautiously. Survival did not mean stopping life. It meant reshaping it. As decades passed, the Black Death slowly lost its power to define every moment. It became a threat, not the only reality. Humanity had learned how to live with the shadow, but just as people began to believe they understood survival, just as they felt stronger and wiser, the world prepared to change again, because the lessons learned from the Black Death were about to reshape not just how humans survived disease, but how they understood themselves, their knowledge, and their place in the world. And that transformation, born from death, was only just beginning. By the time humanity entered the later decades, after the Black Death's first devastation, survival was no longer just about avoiding the plague itself. It was about living in a world permanently altered by it. The disease had carved deep marks into human behavior, memory, and structure. Even when no one was visibly sick, the fear remained, quiet but constant, like a shadow that never fully disappeared. People had learned that danger could arrive without warning. A normal morning could turn into a funeral by nightfall. This awareness sharpened human instincts. Survivors became observers. They watched the sky, the seasons, the movement of traders, the mood of cities. Nothing felt random anymore. Everything might be a sign. One of the most powerful survival tools during this period was memory passed through generations. Elders told children stories, not as history, but as warnings. They spoke of entire families lost, of streets filled with silence, of towns erased from maps. These stories were not meant to terrify, but to teach. Forgetting was dangerous. Remembering kept people alive. Communities developed early warning systems, even without formal organization. If sickness appeared in one household, neighbors noticed immediately. News traveled fast by word of mouth. Fear moved faster than the disease itself. In many cases, this fear saved lives. Towns closed their gates at the first whisper of trouble. Villages disappeared into isolation, cutting themselves off from the world. Isolation became a kind of shield. It was no longer seen as cowardice, but wisdom. In cities, officials became more organized. They hired watchers to patrol streets. They recorded illnesses. They controlled movement. While harsh, these systems reduced chaos. Order became a survival strategy. The idea that human behavior could control disaster slowly took root. This was a turning point. For the first time, humans began to believe that catastrophe was not always unavoidable. That action mattered. That choices mattered. Medical thinking, though still flawed, continued to evolve. Some doctors began focusing less on mystical explanations and more on symptoms. They noticed that certain signs meant death was likely, while others meant recovery. They began separating the sick from the healthy sooner. These small steps saved lives. Hospitals changed as well. They became places of separation rather than cure. Their main purpose was no longer healing, but containment. While grim, this approach reduced spread. Survival meant accepting that not everyone could be saved. Families faced impossible choices. Parents sent sick children away. Spouses separated. Love was tested against survival. Many choices haunted survivors for the rest of their lives, but those choices kept communities alive. Outside cities, rural life transformed. With fewer people, land was plentiful. Diets improved. People ate better, lived in cleaner conditions, and worked less intensely. Stronger bodies meant stronger resistance to disease. Survival became physical as much as behavioral. The natural world responded too. With fewer humans, ecosystems shifted. Rat populations fluctuated. Flea cycles changed. Disease dynamics altered. The plague became less explosive, still dangerous, but slower. Humanity had unintentionally changed the environment in ways that protected itself. Emotionally, survivors lived with constant tension. Happiness felt temporary. Plans felt uncertain. Yet humans adapted even to this. They learned to live in the present, to value small moments, to find meaning despite fear. This emotional resilience became one of humanity's greatest survival tools. Communities also learned cooperation. While fear caused isolation, shared memory created unity. Towns supported each other by sharing warnings. Travelers were questioned carefully, not blindly attacked. There was cruelty, but there was also compassion shaped by experience. Over time, the Black Death became a teacher, a brutal one, but a teacher nonetheless. It taught humans humility. It taught them that nature could not be controlled, only respected. It taught them that knowledge must come from observation, not blind belief. These lessons did not disappear when the plague weakened. They stayed embedded in society. As decades passed, outbreaks continued, but they were smaller, less deadly. Humanity no longer panicked as blindly. Systems were in place. Memory guided action. Survival became more reliable, though never guaranteed. And yet, the greatest change was not physical or medical. It was mental. Humans began to question authority, to doubt traditions that failed them, to seek answers through experience. This shift, born from survival instinct, would eventually lead to new ways of thinking, new sciences, and new understanding of the world. The Black Death had forced humanity to grow up, but growth does not come without pain. Trauma lingered, fear lingered, trust was fragile. The world felt older, heavier, quieter. Still, humanity stood stronger than before, and as the plague slowly retreated into history, leaving scars instead of dominance, a new chapter of human survival was about to begin, one shaped not by reaction, but by preparation, curiosity, and the dangerous idea that humans could learn from disaster. That idea would soon change everything. As time moved forward, something remarkable happened. Humanity did not simply survive the Black Death by hiding and reacting anymore. It began to rebuild itself around survival. The plague had become part of life's background, like storms or droughts. Still feared, but no longer mysterious in the same way. People began preparing for it before it arrived. This was not preparation with medicine or science as we know it today. It was preparation of habits, structures, and mindset. Cities that had once been cramped and chaotic slowly changed their shape. Narrow alleyways were widened. Open squares became more common. Fresh water sources were protected more carefully. Waste was pushed farther from living spaces. These changes were not driven by understanding germs, but by memory. People remembered where death spread fastest. They remembered the worst streets. They remembered which neighborhoods emptied first. Survival left fingerprints on architecture. Homes were designed with more windows. Light and air were welcomed in. Darkness and dampness were feared. People believed sickness hid in shadows. Without realizing it, they were reducing environments where rats and fleas thrived. Trade, once reckless and constant, became cautious. Merchants accepted delays. Goods were aired out before use. Ports enforced waiting periods strictly. This slowed economies, but it saved lives. Survival was now valued more than speed or profit. And then there was the human body itself. Generations born after the worst years of the plague were different, not visibly, but internally. Stronger immune responses became more common. Those whose ancestors survived carried quiet protection in their blood. The plague still killed, but not as easily. Humanity was slowly adapting at a biological level, shaped by centuries of suffering. But survival was not only physical. The human mind carried deep scars. People lived with constant awareness of loss. Many had grown up without parents. Many had buried siblings, friends, lovers. Emotional attachment became cautious. People loved deeply, but carefully. They understood how fast everything could disappear. This awareness created a strange strength. When new outbreaks came, panic still existed, but it was focused. People knew what to do. They closed doors. They separated. They waited. Patience became a survival skill. Waiting out danger became normal. In earlier years, crowds had gathered to pray together, unknowingly spreading death. Now people prayed alone. Faith became quieter, more personal, less performative. This shift reduced gatherings, once again helping survival in ways people did not fully understand. Governments also changed. Rulers realized that dead populations could not produce wealth or armies. Protecting people became practical, not just moral. Public health measures, though crude, became political priorities. Laws were created to control movement during outbreaks. Punishments were enforced for breaking quarantine. This was a new idea. That leadership included responsibility for survival. Hospitals evolved further. They became places of separation and observation. Some doctors began tracking symptoms over time. They noticed who lived and who died. They noticed that survival was not random. Patterns existed. These early observations were fragile sparks of science. Education slowly expanded beyond religion. Learning how the world worked became valuable. Curiosity was no longer dangerous. It was useful. This curiosity was born from a simple question repeated across generations. Why did some survive and others did not? Meanwhile, culture reflected everything humanity had endured. Stories were filled with warnings. Songs carried sadness. Art showed skeletons dancing with the living. These images were not just morbid. They were reminders. Memory preserved survival. Children grew up hearing these stories. They learned caution before courage, awareness before action. This shaped a society that valued foresight. Still, the plague tested humanity again and again. Some generations forgot. Some became careless. When outbreaks returned, they paid the price. But each time, fewer mistakes were repeated. Humanity learned slowly, painfully, but permanently. One of the most important changes was acceptance. People accepted that death could not be fully controlled, but they also accepted that survival could be improved. This balance between humility and action became humanity's strongest shield. Instead of believing disaster was purely fate, people believed it could be managed. This belief changed everything. It encouraged planning, observation, preparation. It laid the groundwork for future medical thinking, future public health, future science. The Black Death did not end suddenly. It faded slowly, retreating into smaller outbreaks, less deadly waves. It stopped defining every moment of life. It became a threat, not a ruler. And as humanity stood on the other side of centuries of fear, it carried something new with it. A deep understanding that survival was not luck alone. It was memory. It was adaptation. It was restraint. It was learning. These lessons, carved into society by unimaginable loss, were about to shape a new era of human thought and progress. And in that coming era, humans would begin asking questions, not just about how to survive death, but how to understand life itself. By the time the Black Death loosened its grip on daily life, humanity was no longer the same species it had been before the plague arrived, not physically in appearance, but internally in how it thought, feared, planned, and remembered. Survival had rewritten human instincts. What once felt unnatural now felt normal. Distance, caution, observation. These were no longer reactions. They were habits. People now lived with a quiet calculation running beneath every decision. Where to go, who to meet, when to travel. Nothing was careless anymore. Even joy was measured. Celebrations were smaller. Gatherings were controlled. Life continued, but always with an invisible boundary drawn around it. One of the greatest tools of survival during this period was collective memory. The plague was no longer just something that happened. It was something that was remembered, retold, and respected. Stories of entire towns dying were passed down like warnings carved into stone. These stories shaped behavior more strongly than laws ever could. Parents taught children not just prayers, but survival instincts. They taught them to notice sickness early, to avoid crowds when fear spread, to listen for rumors and take them seriously. Knowledge was no longer abstract. It was practical. It meant the difference between life and death. This transfer of memory became one of humanity's strongest defenses. In cities, officials became more systematic. They mapped outbreaks. They tracked death street by street. They noticed that disease followed people, not stars, that it moved with ships, caravans, and crowds. These observations challenged centuries of belief, but survival gave them power. When belief failed and observation succeeded, people paid attention. Slowly, a new way of thinking emerged. People began asking how instead of why. How does it spread? How does it stop? How does it move? These questions did not yet have clear answers, but the act of asking them mattered. It marked a shift from helplessness to to investigation. Quarantine became more refined. Not just ships, but people were isolated. Entire neighborhoods were sealed off. Food was delivered without contact. Guards enforced distance. These systems were harsh, but they worked better than anything before them. Survival demanded discipline. Communities that followed these rules lived. Those that resisted often died. This harsh truth spread quickly. Rural life continued to play a major role in survival. Many families permanently relocated away from cities. Small, spread-out communities became safer. Farming villages learned to control contact with outsiders. Some survived decades without a single outbreak. Isolation, once feared as loneliness, became associated with safety. Meanwhile, the human body continued its silent adaptation. Survivors passed on resistance to their children. Each generation was slightly harder to kill than the last. The plague still returned, but it faced stronger hosts every time. Humanity was evolving under pressure, shaped by death itself. Emotionally, survivors carried deep scars. Many lived with constant anxiety. Every illness felt dangerous. Every fever triggered panic. But humans adapted emotionally as well. They learned to live with uncertainty, to accept fear without letting it freeze them. Emotional resilience became essential. Communities developed rituals to cope. Not grand ceremonies, but quiet routines. Cleaning, waiting, watching. These rituals gave people a sense of control. Control reduced panic. Reduced panic improved survival. Art and culture continued to reflect this mindset. Images of death remained common, but they slowly changed tone. Instead of pure terror, they carried messages of balance. Life and death side by side. Warnings without despair. Acceptance without surrender. Religion also transformed further. Faith became less about preventing disaster and more about enduring it. Spiritual strength replaced blind expectation. This helped people survive psychologically, even when physical survival was uncertain. Doctors, though still lacking true medical knowledge, became more disciplined observers. They compared outbreaks across regions. They noticed that some practices helped and others harmed. They slowly abandoned the most deadly treatments. This was not a revolution, but a gradual shedding of mistakes. Survival improved incrementally. One of the most important developments was time. People learned that waiting could save lives. Waiting before entering cities. Waiting before reopening markets. Waiting before declaring safety. Patience became a shield against disaster. This patience reshaped society. Life slowed down. Decisions were delayed. Rash action was punished by memory. Survival favored restraint. And yet, humans never stopped living. Love still formed. Families still grew. Laughter still returned. cautiously at first, then more freely. Humanity learned that survival did not mean hiding forever. It meant knowing when to emerge. As outbreaks became smaller and less frequent, people dared to hope again. But this hope was different. It was cautious, grounded, built on experience rather than innocence. The Black Death no longer ruled humanity, but it had changed it permanently. Humans now understood something profound. That survival was not a single victory, but a continuous process, a balance between action and restraint, between fear and courage, between memory and movement. And as this understanding settled into the foundations of society, it prepared humanity for something even greater, because the lessons learned from surviving the Black Death were about to ignite a transformation that would push humans toward new knowledge, new science, and a new understanding of the world itself. The age of survival was slowly turning into the age of inquiry. And with that shift, humanity stepped closer to uncovering truths that would change its future forever. As the memory of the Black Death stretched further into the past, it did not fade. Instead, it settled deep into the foundation of human thinking. People no longer spoke of survival as something dramatic or heroic. Survival became quiet, deliberate, and built into daily life. The plague had taught humanity that the greatest threats often arrived unseen, and that awareness was the only early warning. Communities now lived with an invisible discipline. Even in times of peace, habits shaped by fear remained. Streets were kept cleaner than before. Waste was pushed farther from homes. Water sources were guarded with care. These actions were not motivated by kindness or beauty, but by memory. People remembered the smell of death. They remembered how filth and crowding seemed to invite disaster. Cleanliness became protection. Cities grew differently. Expansion was cautious. Authorities hesitated before allowing overcrowding. Housing regulations, though primitive, appeared. Space mattered. Air mattered. Light mattered. Without understanding microbes, people had learned to shape environments that were less welcoming to disease. Survival was now embedded in stone and wood. Trade, the lifeblood of civilization, adapted permanently. Merchants accepted loss in exchange for safety. Quarantine stations became common near ports and borders. Goods were stored, aired, and sometimes destroyed if suspected of carrying sickness. This slowed commerce, but it prevented catastrophe. Humanity had learned that unchecked movement could be deadly. The relationship between individuals and authority also changed. People expected leaders to act during outbreaks. Inaction was no longer tolerated. Survival became a shared responsibility. Governments that failed to protect their populations lost trust, sometimes violently. This expectation marked a turning point in human society. Public health, though unnamed, was born. knowledge slowly became centralized. Records were kept. Outbreaks were compared across decades. Scholars noticed patterns repeating themselves. They observed that disease followed people, not curses. That isolation worked more often than prayer alone. These observations challenged old beliefs, but survival gave them weight. When tradition and experience conflicted, experience increasingly won. Medical thinking shifted again, quietly and unevenly. Some doctors still clung to ancient explanations, but others began experimenting cautiously. They focused on care rather than cure, comfort rather than intervention. They noticed that rest, warmth, and separation improved chances of survival. These were small realizations, but they mattered. The human body continued its slow transformation. Survivors passed resistance to their children. Over generations, communities became less vulnerable. The plague did not disappear, but it struggled more. Each return was met with stronger hosts and faster reactions. Humanity was no longer an easy target. Emotionally, the scars remained deep. Many people lived with inherited fear. Stories of death were told by grandparents who had heard them from their own elders. This generational trauma shaped behavior. People avoided extremes. They valued stability. They distrusted sudden change. Survival favored caution over ambition. Yet, alongside fear, curiosity grew. If humans could survive such devastation, what else could they understand? This question quietly spread through universities and monasteries. Observation became respected. Recording reality became important. The idea that the world followed patterns began to take hold. This shift laid the groundwork for future breakthroughs. The methods used to survive the plague, watching, recording, comparing, adjusting, became tools for understanding nature itself. Survival had taught humanity how to learn. The Black Death had once reduced humans to helpless victims. Now, it had turned them into careful observers of their own world. Disease was no longer purely divine punishment. It was something that moved, spread, and could be slowed. Life slowly regained color. Music returned to streets. Markets reopened with caution. Children played again, though watched closely. Humanity learned to balance fear with living. This balance was fragile, but it endured. The plague no longer dominated every thought, but it was never forgotten. It became a reference point, a reminder of what happened when warning signs were ignored. A memory that guided decisions long after the danger passed. As centuries moved forward, the Black Death transformed from an active threat into a defining memory. That memory shaped how humans approached health, knowledge, and responsibility. It turned survival into preparation into understanding. And as humanity stood stronger, wiser, and more cautious than ever before, it approached the final stage of its transformation. one where survival would give rise not just to endurance, but to progress that would forever change the relationship between humans and disease. That final shift was already beginning to take shape, quietly, patiently, waiting to unfold. By the time the Black Death truly loosened its grip on humanity, the world had entered a new rhythm. Death was no longer sudden and unknowable in the same way it had once been. It was still feared, still respected, but it was no longer absolute chaos. Humans had learned how to live around it, how to anticipate it, and most importantly, how to recover from it. The greatest victory of survival was not the end of the plague itself. It was the endurance of society. After centuries of loss, communities no longer collapsed completely when outbreaks returned. Systems held. Food distribution continued. Laws, though strained, remained in place. Life bent, but it no longer shattered. This resilience was the result of everything humans had learned through suffering. Cities now carried invisible layers of protection built from memory. Quarantine zones stood ready even when empty. Emergency rules existed before they were needed. People knew where to go, what to avoid, and when to stay still. Survival had become organized. One of the most important shifts was psychological. Humans no longer believed disaster meant the end of everything. They had lived through the worst imaginable and were still standing. This confidence was fragile, but real. It changed how people faced future threats. Instead of surrendering to panic, people prepared. Instead of waiting for miracles, they acted. This mindset transformed medicine, though true understanding of germs was still far away. The foundation had been laid. Observation mattered. Experience mattered. Recording reality mattered. The belief that nature followed rules humans could study, was growing stronger. Hospitals became permanent institutions, not just shelters for the dying, but places of organization and care. Separation of patients became standard. Cleanliness was enforced more strictly. Medical training improved slowly, generation by generation. Survival demanded improvement, and improvement followed. Public health became a shared idea. Streets were maintained not just for beauty, but for safety. Water systems improved. Waste removal became structured. These changes reduced disease far beyond the plague itself. Humanity had unknowingly protected its future. The Black Death also changed how humans viewed time. Long-term thinking became valuable, planning for years instead of days, preparing for threats that might return decades later. This patience reshaped governance, economics, and culture. Families saved resources. Cities built reserves. Communities practiced restraint. Survival had taught humans that tomorrow mattered. Emotionally, people learned acceptance. They accepted uncertainty as part of life. This acceptance reduced panic and increased resilience. Fear no longer controlled every decision. It informed decisions, but did not dominate them. Art and storytelling reflected this maturity. Death was no longer portrayed only as terror. It was portrayed as a companion to life, a reminder of fragility, not just an enemy. This perspective allowed people to live fully, without forgetting what they had endured. The plague itself became weaker with time. Smaller outbreaks occurred, but they no longer reshaped the entire world. Humanity responded quickly, isolated, waited, recovered. Survival had become reliable. Most importantly, humans had changed their relationship with knowledge. They trusted observation. They valued evidence. They recorded what they saw. This approach, born from survival instinct, would eventually lead to scientific revolutions that transformed medicine forever. But even without modern science, humanity had already achieved something extraordinary. It had survived the greatest biological disaster in recorded history, not through strength, not through weapons, not through divine intervention, but through adaptation, through memory, through restraint, through learning. The Black Death had stripped humanity down to its most vulnerable state and forced it to rebuild itself from the ground up. In doing so, it reshaped human behavior, cities, governments, medicine, and thought itself. Survival was not a single moment. It was centuries of adjustment, pain, and growth. And as the echoes of the plague faded into history, humanity carried those lessons forward, prepared, perhaps unknowingly, for every challenge that would come after. Because once humans learned how to survive the Black Death, they learned something even more powerful. They learned how to survive anything, even after the Black Death had passed through Europe and Asia countless times, leaving cities half empty and villages ghostly. Its influence on humanity continued in ways that were invisible yet profound. The people who survived were not just living, they were learning, adjusting, and slowly transforming the very fabric of society around them. What had once been chaos became a teacher, and the lessons it imparted were etched deeply into memory, behavior, and culture. Survival had become more than instinct. It had become an art. In towns and cities, the changes were most obvious. Urban planning slowly shifted, often without conscious thought, guided by lessons hard-earned from catastrophe. Narrow, crowded streets that had once helped towns maximize trade and living space were gradually widened. Open squares were prioritized, not for aesthetics, but because they allowed for movement, air, and observation. Fresh water sources were carefully guarded. Wells were monitored. Sewers, though primitive, were dug deeper, farther from living spaces. Markets were reorganized, with stalls spaced apart to reduce the mingling of humans and fleas. Every action, every change, was a quiet declaration of survival. Humans had begun shaping their environment, unconsciously learning the earliest principles of public health. Trade, which had once brought wealth with reckless abandon, now carried caution alongside its goods. Merchants, who had seen entire caravans wiped out by invisible forces, understood that speed could be deadly. Ships arriving in ports were inspected, delayed, or even refused entry if illness was suspected. Coins were sometimes soaked in vinegar, letters smoked over fires, and goods isolated before handling. These measures were crude, often symbolic, but they worked to slow the spread of disease. Humanity had begun to grasp a basic truth. Survival required action, foresight, and sometimes sacrifice. Inside homes, daily life was reshaped by invisible fear. Families avoided unnecessary contact. Children played under strict supervision. Courtyards became preferred spaces for gathering, where air and sunlight reduced danger. Beds were spaced apart. Kitchens were kept cleaner. Laundry was hung in the sun to dry. Every choice reflected the knowledge that survival depended not on luck, but on habits carefully formed and diligently maintained. Habits became shields, and habits were now inherited alongside genes. The human body itself had changed, too. Survivors of the first waves of the plague carried subtle immunities, genetic traces that gave them and their descendants an edge against future outbreaks. Each passing generation was slightly stronger, slightly more resistant. The Black Death, terrifying as it was, had also been a filter. It had carved resilience into bloodlines, ensuring that humanity endured where it might have faltered before. The body, like the mind, was adapting silently. Emotionally, humanity bore scars that were just as real as physical ones. Anxiety had become part of life. People lived in the shadow of past death. Every cough, every fever, every unexpected visitor carried a weight that could not be ignored. Yet, remarkably, humans found ways to coexist with fear. Patience became a weapon. Observation became a survival skill. People learned to balance alertness with routine. Life, even in its tension, went on. Music returned to streets, though quieter. Laughter echoed, though cautiously. Children grew up learning not to be reckless, taught early that every moment carried potential danger. Governments began to institutionalize survival. Local officials tracked deaths carefully, keeping crude records of outbreaks. Quarantine rules were written down and enforced. Those who resisted often faced harsh consequences. For the health of the many outweighed the desires of the individual. Leaders had learned that unchecked spread could decimate armies, economies, and cities alike. Governance, once focused on control and taxation alone, had become a tool for protection. It was the first quiet step toward the idea of public health. Even religion adapted. While faith had once promised protection from divine wrath, It now offered endurance and community rather than certainty of safety. Personal devotion grew more common. Collective rituals were reduced or modified. Prayer became a quiet companion, supporting mental resilience rather than dictating physical outcomes. Spirituality shifted from a promise of intervention to a framework for coping, giving humans a psychological shield as effective as the walls of a city. Art and literature, too, reflected survival's new priorities. Paintings of death were everywhere, yet they evolved. Skeletons danced beside the living, but the compositions were no longer pure terror. Death was contextualized. It was a companion, a teacher, a warning. Stories recorded real experiences. Entire neighborhoods disappearing, families lost, small victories of those who isolated or fled in time. Art became memory, memory became teaching, and teaching became survival. Meanwhile, knowledge slowly consolidated. Scholars and physicians began comparing records from different towns, different countries, different decades. They noticed patterns. Outbreaks often followed certain routes, roads, rivers, and trade networks. Certain measures seemed to work. Separation, isolation, cleanliness, observation. Though still rudimentary, this empirical approach was unprecedented. Humanity had begun to understand the principle of cause and effect in disease. Centuries before bacteria were discovered, survival was now guided by observation as much as instinct. Even mortality itself had been reshaped. The plague had killed indiscriminately, but those who survived carried an invisible advantage. Immunity, both acquired and inherited, transformed population dynamics. Future outbreaks were less devastating. Survivors lived to pass on their knowledge. The Black Death was no longer a sudden force of annihilation, but a shaping pressure that filtered and strengthened humanity. And yet, fear never fully vanished. It persisted as a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Humanity had learned to live alongside it, to respect it, and to plan for it. The plague had taught lessons in patience, caution, observation, and adaptation. It had reshaped how cities functioned, how governments acted, how families behaved, and how individuals perceived the fragility of life. Humans were no longer innocent in the face of catastrophe. They were wise, cautious, and resilient. Through this slow transformation, humanity achieved something extraordinary. Not the conquest of the plague, nor the end of suffering, but the ability to survive consistently across generations against an enemy invisible, relentless, and indiscriminate. This was the ultimate triumph, the mastery of endurance, the creation of systems and habits that allowed life to continue, even in the shadow of death. As the centuries moved on, the Black Death faded from daily awareness. It became history, then memory, then myth. Yet its lessons endured in the quiet ways people lived. In cities built with space and air, in families cautious yet resilient, in governments that recognized responsibility, and in the human instinct to observe, adapt, and survive. And while the plague itself became a shadow of its former self, the resilience it forced upon humanity became permanent. Humans had survived not through luck, not through strength alone, but through the combination of memory, adaptation, and unyielding vigilance. They had learned how to endure the unimaginable, and in doing so, had rewritten what it meant to live in a world where death was never far, but life could still flourish. The Black Death had come. It had taken millions, and yet, in its wake, humanity had emerged stronger, wiser, and quietly prepared for whatever threats the future might bring. And in that survival, a new story began, one of understanding, adaptation, and the relentless human drive to endure against all odds. By the time the Black Death had finally loosened its relentless grip, humanity had changed in ways far deeper than anyone could have imagined. The plague had not just killed, it had rewritten the rhythm of life, the rules of society, and even the way people thought. Cities, villages, and farms alike were no longer merely places to live. They had become instruments of survival. Every stone, every street, every household carried lessons learned from centuries of repeated catastrophe. People moved differently. They planned differently. They lived differently. Survivors had developed a rhythm between caution and daily life, a balance that was both fragile and essential. Fear had become a companion, but it was no longer paralyzing. People watched, they waited, they reacted with precision honed by generations of loss. A cough, a fever, even the movement of strangers was noticed immediately. Knowledge passed quietly from one neighbor to another, from parent to child. It was not written in books yet, but it was stored in memory, in habits, in instinct. Survival had become encoded into the very behaviors of society. Urban life, in particular, had transformed. Cities were no longer simply crowded marketplaces or centers of trade. They had become organized ecosystems of human resilience. Streets were widened to allow movement and ventilation. Public wells were guarded, cleaned, and monitored. Open spaces were created, not for aesthetics, but to reduce the concentration of people and the spread of disease. Markets were redesigned with physical separation in mind. Even the smallest details, laundry dried in sunlight, animals kept away from homes, waste disposed of at a distance, were deliberate acts of survival. Trade routes, which once spread goods without thought of consequence, were now carefully managed. Merchants carried not only goods, but also knowledge of outbreaks. Letters, coins, and packages were treated cautiously. Ships were held in quarantine before entering ports. Goods were aired, cleaned, or even destroyed if they were suspected carriers of disease. Business was still conducted, but with a careful calculation of risk. Humanity had begun to understand that survival was intertwined with economy, that every decision could tip the balance between life and death. Education evolved alongside these changes. Children no longer learned only prayers or moral lessons. They learned to observe, to notice symptoms, to understand the consequences of crowded living. Parents taught the patterns of past outbreaks. Which towns fell first, which neighborhoods survived, and which habits brought safety. Stories of death became lessons of caution, survival, and endurance. Generational memory replaced superstition. People no longer relied purely on divine intervention. They relied on what they had seen work. The Black Death also reshaped the way humans understood their own bodies. Survivors passed subtle forms of immunity to their children, slowly strengthening communities at a biological level. Over generations, this invisible resistance became a quiet safeguard. Future outbreaks no longer destroyed entire populations. Humanity had adapted internally as well as externally. Bodies, like cities, had become more resilient. Emotionally, people carried the weight of what they had endured. Trauma was everywhere, though often unspoken. Families had been decimated, parents buried children, siblings vanished, friends disappeared. But alongside grief, there was a remarkable resilience. Humans learned to live with uncertainty. They balanced fear with hope, caution with courage. Emotional endurance became as crucial to survival as physical safety. Religious life adapted in parallel. Faith no longer promised safety from the plague, but instead offered endurance. Spiritual practices became more personal, quieter, and introspective. Communities gathered less often, but individuals found solace in prayer, reflection, and ritual. Religion became a psychological tool for coping, helping people survive mentally even when physical danger loomed. Meanwhile, medical practice slowly began to change. Physicians recorded symptoms, compared outbreaks, and noticed patterns. While knowledge of disease causation remained limited, observation and documentation became increasingly valued. Some doctors noted that isolation, fresh air, and moderate diets improved survival, while harsh treatments often worsened outcomes. These small empirical lessons, born of necessity, would lay the foundation for centuries of progress. Art and culture mirrored these transformations. Paintings, literature, and music reflected life's fragility. Death was ever present in imagery, but it was balanced with depictions of life, hope, and resilience. Stories of lost communities, courageous survivors, and quiet victories passed into folklore. Art became both memory and teaching, a record of humanity's adaptation, a lesson in survival for future generations. Even governance evolved. Rulers, realizing the importance of protecting populations, began to enforce quarantine laws, monitor trade, and intervene during outbreaks. Public health became a consideration in policy, not merely an afterthought. Leadership was measured not only in conquest or wealth, but in the ability to safeguard life. Societies that learned this early flourished. Those that resisted often paid dearly. Survival was now a societal responsibility. Across all these transformations, one fundamental truth had emerged. Survival was not random. It was a product of observation, adaptation, memory, and action. Humanity had learned that while death could be swift and indiscriminate, preparation and restraint could tip the balance. Life could persist, even in the shadow of catastrophe. And yet, the story of survival was far from over. While humans had endured, adapted, and learned, the Black Death had left its mark permanently. Generations carried both trauma and wisdom. Cities and villages retained the structures, habits, and systems born from centuries of fear. Individuals carried vigilance, patience, and the understanding that life was fragile and fleeting. This delicate balance between living and surviving would define the centuries to come. Humanity had learned to coexist with death, to respect it, to anticipate it, and to endure it. But perhaps the most profound change was invisible. The understanding that life, knowledge, and preparation were intertwined, and that the true legacy of the Black Death was not just survival, but the transformation of how humans viewed themselves, their world, and their power to endure against even the greatest of threats. As centuries moved forward, the lessons of survival would ripple through generations, shaping the way humans approached every challenge, whether plague, famine, or war. Humanity had faced annihilation and had emerged not merely alive, but fundamentally changed. And that change, born from fear, loss, and endurance, was only the beginning of a new chapter in the story of civilization. Even centuries after the first wave of the Black Death, the echoes of its devastation remained alive in every corner of human society. Cities, villages, and farmlands bore the subtle marks of transformation, etched into their streets, homes, and routines. Humans no longer walked through life as if immune to catastrophe. Every cough, every fever, every sudden absence carried weight. Survival had become a way of thinking, a way of seeing the world, and a way of acting. What once seemed uncontrollable was now approached with caution, planning, and respect. In urban centers, the very architecture of life had changed. Buildings were no longer stacked tightly without regard for airflow or sunlight. Windows were larger. Houses were spaced further apart. Courtyards, once decorative or optional, were now essential for air and light. Markets were redesigned to reduce congestion, and public squares became spaces not just of commerce, but of observation, places where humans could see, and measure the movement of people and disease. The shape of the city had become a survival tool. Every street, every alley, every wall carried the wisdom of what had worked and what had failed. The way people traveled also evolved. Trade remained vital, but merchants moved with caution. Caravan routes were chosen not just for speed or profit, but for safety. Ports enforced quarantines for arriving ships, sometimes for weeks. Letters and packages were handled carefully, often held in sunlight or smoke to prevent unseen contamination. These practices, primitive as they were, significantly reduced the spread of disease. Survival had become embedded in daily commerce. Even when prosperity mattered, caution was prioritized, a direct lesson of hard experience. At home, habits became shields. Families kept animals away from living spaces. Kitchens were cleaned meticulously. Laundry was dried in open sunlight. Infants and children were observed closely for any signs of illness, and communities often monitored them collectively. Social norms shifted. Hugging, handshakes, and close contact were replaced by distance, observation, and prudence. Love and community remained, but they were tempered by experience, by memory, and by the quiet understanding that death could arrive without warning. Medical practice, still far from modern science, had begun to evolve in remarkable ways. Physicians documented symptoms, compared outbreaks across regions, and noticed patterns. Some realized that isolation, rest, and fresh air improved survival, while treatments that were harsh or invasive often worsened outcomes. Hospitals had changed from places solely for care into centers for observation, containment, and prevention. Doctors were learning that watching, recording, and acting preemptively was often more valuable than attempting to cure what could not yet be cured. These were small steps, but they marked a profound shift in human thinking. Emotionally, the survivors of the plague and the generations born after it carried a quiet vigilance. Fear persisted, but it was focused and controlled. Panic no longer dictated action. Instead, people balanced alertness with routine. They learned to endure uncertainty and to find joy in small, careful moments. Music, storytelling, and art returned to life, but they were suffused with the memory of loss. Skeletons danced beside living figures in paintings, not merely to terrify, but to remind people of mortality and resilience together. Stories of towns emptied, families lost, and narrow escapes became part of cultural memory, shaping behavior, etiquette, and decision-making for generations. Religious life, too, had transformed. Worship became more personal, quieter, and introspective. Community rituals were moderated, and prayer served as mental and emotional support rather than a guarantee of protection. Spirituality helped people survive psychologically, giving them strength when survival depended not on medicine or walls, but on endurance and patience. Faith had shifted from expecting intervention to cultivating resilience. Governments and leadership structures also evolved. Authorities who had learned the lessons of the plague prioritized the protection of their populations. Quarantine laws were enforced. Travel restrictions were imposed during outbreaks, and penalties existed for those who defied them. Survival was no longer a private matter. It had become a societal responsibility. Societies that recognized this endured better than those that did not. The Black Death had shown that unchecked fear, negligence, or arrogance could wipe out entire populations, and no ruler wished to face that again. Biologically, humanity had been subtly shaped by survival. Those who had endured passed on stronger immunity to their descendants, and communities gradually became more resilient. While outbreaks still occurred, they no longer carried the same inevitability of death. Human bodies had adapted in silent, invisible ways, making each generation slightly harder to destroy than the last. Survival was both behavioral and biological, a dual shield forged from memory and inheritance. And yet, the plague had left another legacy, one far more profound than architecture, medicine, or governance. It had instilled a collective awareness of fragility and the power of preparation. Humans now understood that life could change in an instant, and that survival depended on foresight, adaptation, and cooperation. Societies learned to value observation over superstition, patience over impulse, and caution over recklessness. These lessons would shape not just recovery from disease, but the way humans approached every challenge, every crisis, and every unknown future. In this way, the Black Death became more than a historical event. It became a teacher, invisible but insistent, guiding the development of humanity for generations. Through the ashes of death, humans had learned to rise with structure, resilience, and understanding. The trauma it left behind was immense, but the knowledge it imparted, encoded in culture, memory, architecture, and habit, was even greater. And as these lessons carried humanity forward, something extraordinary began to emerge. The quiet transformation from merely surviving to preparing, observing, and understanding. From this transformation, humans would eventually move beyond reactionary survival toward knowledge, innovation, and progress, setting the stage for an entirely new relationship with the world and its unseen dangers. The story of the Black Death was no longer only a tale of destruction. It had become a testament to the endurance, intelligence, and adaptability of humanity, a story that would echo through centuries, whispering lessons about fear, loss, memory, and the unyielding drive to endure against any threat. By the time the shadows of the Black Death had receded from the streets and villages, humanity had been quietly reshaped, layer by layer, by by centuries of suffering and survival. What was remarkable was not simply that humans had endured, but how they had endured through observation, adaptation, and the careful accumulation of knowledge passed down across generations. Survival had ceased to be random or purely instinctual. It had become deliberate, ingrained, and almost ritualistic, woven into daily life in ways so subtle that most people no longer recognized the lessons they carried from one generation to the next. The urban landscapes bore witness to these lessons. Streets were broader than before, designed to allow air and sunlight to penetrate what had once been cramped, dark alleys. Open spaces, squares, and marketplaces were positioned not just for convenience, but to reduce density and create natural observation points where the movement of people could be monitored. Wells and water sources were protected with care, cleaned regularly, and located at a safe distance from homes and livestock. In the absence of scientific understanding of germs, these choices were guided by memory, painful, lived experience etched into community practices. Every corner of a town, every layer of construction reflected a quiet wisdom. Survival was a spatial problem as much as a biological one. Trade, which had once been blind to risk, evolved with caution. Merchants traveling across continents or along rivers learned that speed and profit could be deadly if they ignored the invisible threat of contagion. Ports developed informal quarantine procedures, often requiring ships to remain anchored for weeks. Goods were aired, cleaned, and sometimes destroyed. Letters, coins, and packages were handled with care. Merchants became carriers not only of commodities, but also of vital knowledge about disease spread and local outbreaks. In this way, commerce became inseparable from survival strategy. Humanity had learned that survival required vigilance in all aspects of life, economic, social, and domestic. At the household level, habits were transformed into shields. Families kept living spaces clean, removed waste far from homes, and ensured air and sunlight penetrated every room. Laundry was hung openly in sunlight, while kitchens and common spaces were scrubbed meticulously. Children were carefully observed for even the slightest signs of sickness, and elders passed down guidance on which symptoms demanded caution. Community surveillance became a form of collective protection. Social interaction was measured and deliberate. While love and companionship persisted, they were tempered by memory and restraint. Every touch, every gathering, carried a calculated awareness of risk. The human body itself had been subtly shaped. Survivors of repeated outbreaks carried immunities that were passed to their descendants, creating populations increasingly resistant to future waves of plague. These biological adaptations worked in tandem with cultural and behavioral strategies. Over time, fewer people succumbed to outbreaks and humanity learned not only to live through disaster, but also to thrive in its aftermath. Resilience was now encoded in both habit and blood. Emotionally, humans had been transformed as profoundly as physically. Fear no longer dominated instinctively. It became focused, disciplined, and functional. The trauma of centuries of loss remained, yet it manifested as vigilance, patience, and careful planning rather than panic. Music, storytelling, and art returned to society, not in careless celebration, but as tools for memory, reflection, and endurance. Images of skeletons dancing beside the living were not just morbid, they reminded people of mortality, encouraging caution without destroying hope. Stories of families saved, neighborhoods isolated in time, and small triumphs over loss were passed down to guide future generations, embedding survival into the cultural consciousness. Religion, too, had adapted to this new human reality. Rituals shifted from public displays to personal devotion. Prayer became a tool for mental resilience rather than a guarantee of physical protection. Communities learned to respect faith as a source of endurance, not as a shield from death. Spiritual practice supported psychological survival, complementing the practical strategies humans had developed to endure biological threats. Governments, recognizing the stakes of unchecked outbreaks, became more proactive. Quarantine laws, though rudimentary, were enforced consistently. Officials monitored trade, travel, and population movement with a seriousness previously unseen. Societies that adopted these measures endured, while those that ignored them suffered further losses. Leadership began to be measured not only by power or wealth, but by the ability to safeguard life. A revolutionary shift in human priorities, shaped entirely by the lessons of survival. Art, education, and literature recorded these transformations, preserving the collective memory of the plague for generations. Children learned not just religion and morals, but also observation, caution, and the consequences of reckless behavior. Knowledge became as much about living safely as about understanding the world. Humanity began to see the world not as a stage of random events, but as a system with patterns that could be studied, understood, and sometimes anticipated. Observation, once purely instinctual, became deliberate and valued. The Black Death, while fading from the streets, had left a permanent imprint on human consciousness. It had forced societies to reconsider how life should be organized, how communities should function, and how survival depended on coordination, patience, and foresight. The lessons were subtle but enduring. The world was unpredictable. Danger could strike anywhere. And yet, preparation, vigilance, and adaptation could make survival possible. Humans had learned that survival was not luck. It was practice. It was habit. It was memory. It was observation and understanding passed from one generation to the next. The plague had stripped humanity to its core and forced it to rebuild not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, and socially. And in this rebuilding, humanity discovered a profound truth. Survival was not a fleeting triumph. It was a skill, a culture, and a legacy. And as humanity carried this legacy forward, it prepared not just to endure future plagues, but to approach the unknown with a new confidence, a cautious, deliberate understanding that life was fragile. But knowledge, preparation, and resilience could give it endurance. The stage was now set for a world that would never forget the lessons of the Black Death. A world where survival itself had become a form of wisdom, quietly guiding the choices of generations yet to come. The final echoes of the Black Death did not roar, they whispered. By the time the plague had retreated from the villages, cities, and countryside, it left behind a world that was profoundly different from the one it had entered. Humanity had survived, yes, but survival was no longer a mere act of chance or luck. It had become a discipline, a practice, and above all, a way of life. The lessons learned over decades of death and uncertainty had seeped into every corner of society, shaping not just behavior, but thought, culture, and the very way humans perceived their existence. Survivors walked differently. They carried themselves with a quiet awareness, a sense that every moment mattered. Every choice could tip the balance between life and death. Streets were cleaner, homes better ventilated, and families observed their own routines with a vigilance born of necessity. Light and air were treasured as if they could repel death itself. Open spaces became sanctuaries, not only of community, but of health, where observation and distance were protective strategies. Urban planning, though primitive, reflected centuries of painful experience. Humanity had learned that the environment itself could be an ally in survival. Trade, once reckless and blind, had become deliberate and cautious. Merchants traveled with awareness, avoiding regions known to harbor sickness, quarantining goods, and sometimes delaying commerce to ensure safety. Money, letters, and even the most mundane items were treated with care. Ports imposed strict procedures for incoming ships, often keeping crews and cargo isolated for weeks. Through this cautious conduct, survival was woven into the very fabric of economic life. Humanity had discovered that vigilance could coexist with prosperity, that caution and trade need not be enemies. At home, survival was encoded into habits. Kitchens and living areas were scrubbed regularly. Laundry dried in sunlight. Children were observed carefully for illness, while elders taught them how to recognize danger. Social norms had shifted. Physical contact was measured. Gatherings were intentional, and every interaction carried a layer of awareness. Communities developed informal networks to observe symptoms, isolate the sick, and protect the vulnerable. Humanity had learned to live with risk, to coexist with invisible threats without surrendering to fear. The human body itself had evolved alongside these societal changes. Survivors had passed subtle immunities to their descendants, creating populations that were gradually more resilient to the disease. While the plague still existed, its mortality decreased with each passing generation. Humanity had survived not only by behavior and memory, but by biology. Every outbreak was met with slightly stronger bodies, slightly wiser societies, and slightly more coordinated responses. Adaptation was no longer optional, it was essential, and it had taken root in every level of human existence. Emotionally, the Black Death left its mark in ways both visible and invisible. Grief was profound, yet resilience endured. Generations had learned to balance fear with patience, observation with caution, and vigilance with everyday life. Music, storytelling, and art reflected both tragedy and survival, teaching lessons quietly through cultural memory. Skeletons danced beside the living in paintings, not merely as reminders of death, but as symbols of endurance. Stories passed down through families became manuals of survival, guiding behavior long after the immediate threat had faded. Religion had adapted as well. Faith no longer promised immunity from death, but offered endurance, guidance, and community. Prayer, ritual, and meditation became tools for mental resilience rather than guarantees of physical protection. Spirituality complemented practical survival strategies, supporting the mind as much as the body. People learned to live with uncertainty, drawing strength from belief while taking practical measures to protect themselves. Governments had also evolved. Officials enforced quarantine laws, monitored trade, and intervened in population movements with greater consistency. Survival had become a collective responsibility, not just an individual one. Societies that adopted these measures thrived, while those that resisted suffered further losses. Leadership was measured not solely by conquest or wealth, but by the ability to preserve life. This transformation marked one of the earliest seeds of public health. Centuries before germ theory or modern medicine would emerge, art, education, and literature preserved the lessons of the plague for generations. Children were taught observation, caution, and the consequences of recklessness alongside traditional subjects. Knowledge became a survival tool. Communities learned that life was fragile, that preparation mattered, and that the past could teach the living how to endure. Memory became action, and action became culture. The greatest legacy of the Black Death was perhaps invisible, yet enduring. The transformation of human perception. Death was no longer an incomprehensible force. It was a reality to respect, anticipate, and plan around. Humanity had learned that while catastrophe could strike without warning, preparation, vigilance, and adaptation could allow life to persist, even flourish, in the face of devastation. The experience had taught patience, observation, restraint, and resilience, the tools of survival that would carry civilizations through countless future challenges. Through centuries of suffering, reflection, and adaptation, humans had discovered an extraordinary truth. Survival was not passive. It was deliberate, learned, and communal. It required memory, careful action, and respect for the forces that could undo life in an instant. And in this understanding, humanity had found its greatest strength. The Black Death, once a force of unimaginable terror, had become a teacher. It had forced humans to confront their fragility and to develop systems, habits, and wisdom that would endure for generations. It had reshaped cities, commerce, medicine, and society. It had taught the mind, the body, and the spirit how to endure. And so, as life returned to the streets and fields once more, humans moved forward, forever changed. They carried the memory of death, but also the knowledge of survival. They had endured the unimaginable and emerged not just alive, but profoundly transformed. They had learned to observe, to adapt, to prepare, and above all, to live deliberately in a world that could vanish in an instant. The story of the Black Death was no longer merely one of devastation. It had become the story of human resilience, ingenuity, and the quiet, enduring power of survival. And from this story, humanity would continue to rise, facing each new challenge with the hard-earned wisdom of centuries past, forever shaped by the plague, yet never defeated by it.